Hi, everybody. I'm talking to you from the foyer in the church building this morning. I hope all of you are doing well. I get to talk to most of you on the phone once in a while, and I sure do miss you. I'm looking forward to seeing you again. I thought I'd take a few minutes this morning to talk about the pandemic and the situation that we're in. You know, we've been in this thing for 2 months now, and still so many things are uncertain. We still don't have any idea how long it's going to last. We don't know if the virus is as dangerous as some say, or will it pass like the flu? We'll see. We're beginning to be uncertain about the summer and the fall. We're wondering if this summer we're going to be able to go out and do some of the things we like to do, especially things for fun. And what about this fall? What about the kids? Are the kids going to be back in school? We're getting mixed messages about that too. Some of you may be thinking about your job. You're wondering how this is all going to play out. Will you have your job in 6 months or a year from now? And you know the question I get asked the most? When are we going to have church services again? Because you're anxious to be back together with your brothers and sisters, and I am too. I really miss it. Some of you tell me you can't remember the day of the week because without Sunday service, you just lose all sense of time. You know, we respond to this in a lot of different ways. Some of you are really pretty much unconcerned. You're just going about your daily business, taking care of things like you always do. And so it's not that big a thing in your mind. But there may be some who are afraid. Maybe you have a health issue and you're concerned about, well, what if I get this virus? I hear that people with these problems sometimes it's fatal. And so you're concerned about that. Or maybe you're concerned about your kids or you're concerned about your grandkids. You're concerned about others. You don't want them to get sick. And some of you are likely irritated with what's going on. You're hearing the decisions by government officials and maybe you don't agree with them and you say, hey, I just think we're on the wrong track. So we're at all different places as we're going through this pandemic. Let me make a few suggestions if I can. First of all, we need to realize we're all going to get frustrated from time to time. I don't know how we can have our lives change so much and not be frustrated sometimes. I surely am. Whether it's just a difficulty of going to the grocery store or Menards or wherever it is you need to go. And sometimes they're sold out of bread or milk or eggs or whatever it happens to be. So it's a big inconvenience, isn't it? And of course, it's inconvenient because we can't do the things that we like to do. And so a lot of those have been set aside for a little while. Well, let me suggest that you still try to do some things. Do some things to relieve the stress. Hey, get outdoors for a while. Go out and play with your kids in the backyard. Play a game together. If you've got some bicycles in your garage, get the bikes out and go for a bike ride. Do something for that. Or even better, maybe take a car ride and just go do a little sightseeing together. Sue and I like to take our dog for a nice long walk down the road. We do that nearly every day. And we just enjoy walking and looking, and we talk about whatever is on our minds. And that's a great way for us to relieve stress. So if you get stressed out, sometimes that's okay. Just try to deal with it in the right way. The second thing is we need to try not to let the situation control our emotions. You know, be careful if you listen to 24-hour politics on the radio or 24-hour news on cable TV. And pretty soon, all the things you hear build up and all the frustration, and you get emotionally charged. And if you do that long enough, you'll find you're just in a bad state of mind. So don't let the situation control your emotions. You know, this thing is going to pass. We all remember 9/11, don't we? We said, wow, we've never had anything like this before. And we said, the world has changed. But in time, life got back to normal. We're doing most of the things we always did before. So it will be with this pandemic. This will pass, And one of these days we'll be talking about it and we'll be telling kids or grandkids about what happened. The third suggestion I've got is that you dedicate some of your time to helping others. I know from personal experience that this is a great way to get through trying times. You see, we're devoting so much of our own time looking at ourselves and our situation. The best way to deflect that is by looking at others and helping them. So why don't you do that? Spend some time doing that. I know you do. Hey, get on that telephone and give somebody a phone call and say, hey, I was just thinking about you. Tell me what's going on with you. Or take the time to send that card out to somebody and let them know that you're thinking about them and want to encourage them. You know, I see on TV that people are doing all kinds of things to help others, whether it's donating food or donating money or even helping volunteering in community organizations to help out people in need. See if there's something you can do that you and your family can do to help someone else. And you know, really, it doesn't have to be too complicated. Look around your neighborhood. Can you go over and maybe mow somebody's yard, or maybe you have an elderly couple down the street? Ask them if you can go buy their groceries for them while you're going to the grocery store. You see, there's so many things we can do to help others if we just take a few minutes and think about it. And you know what? You'll find you feel a lot better when you do. I know I always do. So those are some suggestions I want to make. I also thought about this. What can we see in Scripture that would help us get through this time? As I thought about that, I thought of a situation when someone else was going through a difficult time. And I thought about how God worked in their situation. And so let me share a few thoughts about that this morning with you, and I hope it will help us in our situation. I'd like to talk to you for a few minutes today about when Israel was in Egypt. When Israel was in Egypt. I'm sure most of you remember their story. Joseph is the one who was sold in slavery, and through the course of events, he ended up in Egypt. He was in Potiphar's house, and then he ended up in jail. But through God's mighty hand and his interpretation of dreams, it wasn't long until Joseph was raised to be a great ruler in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. But the Bible tells us that the generations passed. And as time passed, there were new pharaohs. And finally, a pharaoh came along who did not like the Israelites, who feared them and made them slaves. Their situation was bad. They were forced into building the great projects of Pharaoh. And so they had to make the bricks and they had to build these tremendous structures for him. The work was grueling. It was hard. The taskmasters, were cruel. They beat them into submission. And so they and their families were suffering a very terrible time. Well, during this time, there were some things that were true. And this is what I want us to think about for a few minutes. First of all, even though they were going through a difficult time, God had not forgotten them. God had not forgotten them. I'm sure there were many times they were asking, why is this going on? Where is God? How long is this going to last? And you know, after they suffered for a period of time, they began to forget how much God had blessed them. They had forgotten that there was a time when they were facing great famine in Israel and Canaan. And unless God provided for them, they would die. And he did. He did it through sending Joseph down to Egypt. And eventually, when Joseph took the rule of Egypt, second only to the Pharaoh, he brought his family there. And there God blessed them. He put them in one of the richest parts of the nation. And they prospered. They prospered both in their wealth and they prospered as a multitude in number. God saved them from terrible famine and he delivered them. They were blessed in Egypt. Exodus chapter 1 and verse 7 says, "The sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and they became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. So he blessed them richly." You know what? They just assumed that this would continue forever, didn't they? And it did for centuries. Isn't it really this way for us? Yeah, just a couple of months ago, everything was normal and we were cruising along in life, doing all the things that we normally do, enjoying things that we normally enjoy. And then all of a sudden it was interrupted. And now, after we've been doing this for a couple months, and maybe we'll be doing it for a while longer, we're thinking about this time we're in rather than the past and how God blessed us then. You know, when we're going through times of great trial, we need to use our memory. We need to remember how God has blessed us in the past and how He delivered us in the past from the problems we had back then. And you know, He will deliver us again. For most of us, this pandemic is just an inconvenience. An inconvenience. Things may get worse before they get better. We don't know. Only time will tell. But I guess we need to prepare our minds for whatever may be ahead. You know, there are people in different places who are losing their jobs. Millions have lost their jobs. And maybe some of us will. We don't know. Some people have had terrible financial setbacks. They'll be rebuilding maybe for years after this is over. Well, that could happen to some of us as well. We don't know. And we all see the numbers of the people that have died from this virus. We are so fortunate that so few have been affected. We have hardly had any cases of the virus, much less deaths. Will this change? Will the virus come to Woodford County? Will any of us suffer, become sick, perhaps even die? We don't know. We don't know what's ahead. You know, when things were bad for the Israelites, believe it or not, they got worse. Well, how could that be? Because Pharaoh was afraid of the Israelites. And do you recall? He gave the order that all the male Hebrew children would be put to death because he didn't want to chance losing control of the people. Can you imagine that if someone was seeking the death of your child? But God had not forgotten them. Listen to Exodus chapter 3 and verse 7. And the Lord said, "I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their suffering." God was aware. He knew what was going on. And it's the same for you and me. Just because we're having difficulty or trials doesn't mean that God has abandoned us. He still knows what's going on. Yes, He is still here with us. I think one of the hardest things about the virus is that it forces us to be apart, separated. That makes it hard. So many of you have said to me, "Wow, I look forward to Sunday mornings when we all get together and oh, that big hug or that greeting or someone is kidding with me." You miss those things. And I'm looking forward to them too. But let me tell you this, the virus may be able to separate us from one another, but it can't separate us from God. And so God is with us. So we can't forget all the things that He has done for us. Let me share a second thing that God was doing. God was preparing for what was ahead. You know, it's a great story about how, it's a great story about how God got Moses into Pharaoh's household. You remember the story, don't you? There was baby Moses, and his mother Jochebed was afraid for him, and he was growing, couldn't hide him any longer because he wasn't just a little baby anymore. And you recall the story about how she took the basket, put him in the basket, floated him near the reeds in the Nile River, and this was a place where Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe. I don't know if she knew this would happen. This may have been part of her plan, or maybe it was just the providence of God. But Pharaoh's daughter would come down to the river to bathe. And so she came down, and when she came to the river, she saw this basket, and there was baby Moses, that cute baby there in the basket. And quickly she fell in love with that baby, wanted to take him home with her. And there was Moses' sister nearby. And she spoke up and said, "Oh, yes, you know that that his mother is nearby." And as it worked out, they called for the mother, and so Jochebed was able even to take care of Moses and wean him, and then follow up with him there in Pharaoh's household. And so then Moses was in the palace of the king. Think about that for a minute. He went from the threat of being put to death as a Hebrew baby to being safe in the king's palace. You know, only God can do things like that. And he can do things like that for us too, can he? And sometimes he does. Well, let's see how God prepared Moses for his task that was ahead. First of all, when he placed Moses in Pharaoh's palace, Moses was trained there in the ways of the Egyptians. Acts chapter 7 and verse 22 says, "And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds." So Moses is right here in the king's palace receiving the best education anyone could have. God was equipping him. And not only was he becoming educated, but he was learning the ways, the customs of the Egyptians. This would be very important later. God also was preparing for what was ahead by letting Moses choose his own people. You recall the story. One day Moses was out walking and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he couldn't help himself. And so he stepped in his countrymen, his brother's defense, and he killed the Egyptian. And that caused a lot of consequences for Moses, didn't it? But Moses was willing to make the choice for his Israelite brother. We read this in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24 and 25. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. God used this incident to prepare for the future. Moses made a tough decision that day, and it cost him dearly. But it was only preparing him for the big decision God would call him to make later. So God was preparing. The third way God was preparing Moses was by sending him to Midian. Maybe you'll recall that he fled away from Egypt. He went to Midian and remained there for 40 years. 40 years in Midian. This is interesting to me. 40 years he was in Midian before God would call him back to rescue his people. It's interesting. I know some of us are restless. I know we're frustrated. I know we want to get things back to normal, whatever that means. But friends, it's only been 2 months. It's only been 2 months. Surely we can withstand 2 months when we think about the things that not only the Israelites went through suffering in Egypt, but Moses had to spend 40 years in Midian before God called him back. We can do this. I know we can. We can make the most of the time. And before long, it will be over. I don't know if it's going to be 2 months or 6 months, but whatever time it is, it will soon be behind us. You know, I believe that God is now preparing for what is ahead. I don't know what that is. You don't know what that is either. But one thing I am certain, God isn't idle. He's doing what needs to be done, and He knows the future now. He's made His plans, and He's preparing. And one day He'll ask us to do what we need to do. Ask yourself this question. How will we be changed because of this virus? How will our church be changed because of this virus? I don't know. I had an interesting experience a few years ago when I was visiting my mother in Texas. She was recovering from surgery in a nursing home, and there was a man who drove her to her doctor's appointments. They had a wheelchair van, and she was confined to a wheelchair at that time. So he would take her along, and while I was there, I was welcome to go along. So I sat up in the front with him, and we rode. And as we drove along, we had a nice conversation. As it turned out, he was from Louisiana, but here he was near Dallas, Texas. And I said, "Well, how did you come to live here?" And he told me, he said, "It's an interesting thing because Hurricane Katrina struck and it destroyed the whole area. Everyone's homes were destroyed. The land was devastated. Their church building was destroyed as well." He said when it happened, their preacher was in Texas visiting with others, and he was there, and the storm hit, and he couldn't even return home. And so as he was trying to call back and finding out how everyone was and thinking what in the world were they going to do, the Christians there in Texas made this suggestion. They found out that their homes were gone. They had no church. Their jobs were gone. What were they going to do? And so they made this suggestion. Why don't you call for your family and your church friends and have them come to Texas? Well, how were they going to do that? Well, these wonderful Christians in Texas said, they can come and stay with us. We'll open our homes and we'll help them find jobs. Now, several years had passed, and here this man had settled with his family in Texas, and he had this job there. He was retired from a federal government job, and so now he was driving for this nursing home facility, enjoying it very much. And he told me he was so excited because his church family from Louisiana was about to open their new church building in Texas. God knew about that all along. He knew about that even before Katrina hit. Well, I don't know what God has in mind for me or for you or even for our church. But we can dream. Why don't we think of some of the great things that God may do with us and think about how He may be preparing us for what is to come? We just have to go along and do His will while we're going through this time. Well, one last thing from this story. God delivered His people as a witness to Egypt. In Exodus chapter 7 and verse 5, we read, "The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them." God would do great things among the Israelites, and He would show the Egyptians that He was the Lord. And so He did. He did it through the plagues, as they all suffered, but God blessed and protected the Israelites. And He did it when the Israelites left Egypt and crossed the Red Sea, and miraculously God brought them through that water, and then the Egyptians were destroyed behind them. Yes, there was a great testimony, a great witness of what God would do to Egypt. This time can be a great witness for us. Do you know that? I know we are trying to take care of ourselves and our needs and the day-to-day activities we have to do. But think about how we can be a witness for God in this time. This is a time of doubt, a time of fear, a time of uncertainty. For some people, a time of anger, a time of rage, a time of fighting, quarreling. We're having a lot of that, aren't we? But what will our witness be? Why don't we be a witness for God and show Him the blessing of God on His people, even during a pandemic? Wouldn't that be a great message to send to others? Well, let me review as I close today. First of all, I want to tell you God has not forgotten us. He knows what's going on. He's right here with us. Secondly, God is preparing for what is ahead. He is not idle. He has a plan. He's working now. And just wait till we see what he's going to do. And we hope, I plan to be a part of it, don't you? And finally, God can use us as a witness to those around us. Why don't you use this opportunity to show others what Christian faith really means? I hope all of you are doing well. God bless you, and I hope to see you all soon.